Go. Well, welcome everyone. And it is hard to believe that we're already here at the end of the semester. And this is our final MI Colloquium for spring 2021. And it's, can you be a master of information? So it's a real pleasure. Well, Colloquium is always fun for me, but it's a real pleasure tonight because not only do we have Stacy Brody, who is our own MI alumni 2018. By the way, Stacy, I tried to find which colloquiums you went to, but it was in e-college and I couldn't find it because e-college got disintermediated, I guess. Anyway, we also have two of our awesome MI faculty, LIS faculty members, and our amazing and impressive RU librarians. So it's just a real treat with that. I'd like to go ahead and get started by talking a little bit about the agenda for tonight. See if it's gonna let me advance. All right, not advancing. Okay, well, here, I'll just go through the agenda for tonight. So for tonight, we're going to, again, start. Marie Radford is going to come on. She's going to do a little bit of a welcome, and then Stacy Brody is going to join us for about 10 minutes, and she's going to tell us the tale of an early career librarian. Then we're going to have opening comments from each one of our panelists, and that's going to be followed by a really interesting panel discussion on, again, ethics and trends in LIS. So we're excited by that, but before we get started, I'd like to welcome Marie Radford, who is our department chair, and she's going to welcome Stacy to our stage. So take it away, Marie.
Okay, are you going to leave the slide up? It's hard to see everybody. Yeah, I like to see everybody. Everybody has their camera off. Okay. So hello, everybody. Everyone knows me as the chair of the LAS department. But in another life, I was a professor of reference for one Stacy Brody. And I'm really delighted to see Stacy. Stacy, I think the last time I saw you was on like in the Capitol, Washington, D.C. I was like milling around. We were at a ALA conference, AZRO, what was it, ALA? And I'm milling around on the Capitol steps or whatever. And here comes Stacy running up and, you know, greeting me. It was always such a pleasure to see you, Stacy. What I was thinking about my introduction of you tonight, I was actually working on a letter of recommendation for one of the participants here, Gabby Schreiner. Gabby Schreiner is one of our alums who is applying now for a PhD program. While I was writing her letter, I was in my recommendation file and I happened to find a recommendation letter that I wrote for you, Stacy. In November 29th, 2017, I wrote a letter for you as an applicant to the Librarians in Residence Selection Committee. And forgive me if I can't talk. I just finished a 3-hour class, a PhD seminar. So I'm a little bit, I don't know, a little tired, Zoom tired, I guess. But let me just read a little bit. I couldn't write a better introduction than the letter that I wrote for Stacy back in 2017. And don't forget, this is also pre-Zoom days. This was pre-Zoom days. So I said, I first met Miss Brody in the spring of 17 when she became my advisee. I had invited her to attend the New Jersey Library Association's College and University New Jersey ACRL luncheon so that I could meet her in person, as we had only previously talked on the phone. I was immediately impressed by Miss Brody's curiosity, entrepreneurial attitude, leadership abilities, intelligence, and warm personality. Upon learning that she had web development experience, I soon asked her to become active with the Rutgers University Academic Librarianship Student Organization, SCARLA. I see you, Jennifer Kaufman, president of SCARLA in our audience tonight, of which I am faculty advisor, and she has stepped up to provide them with outstanding web support. Miss Brody has had an interesting background that gives her an extraordinary perspective to bring to her studies in library science at Rutgers. She has had years of experience in public relations and marketing, in agriculture, and the wine industry. She had started her own wine tasting business. She is a total pleasure to work with and to have as a student. Her work is of extraordinary high caliber. In fall 2017, I had the pleasure of having Ms. Brody as a student in my reference sources and services class. I was delighted to have Ms. Brody in this class, especially to have the opportunity to get to know her better as a scholar. I have been extremely impressed by her extraordinary academic performance and dedication to her studies. In all of her assignments, be they minor or major, they have been superb, going well beyond what is required. In class discussions, she steps up and takes a position without hesitation, and then presents different ways to frame issues, suggesting innovation solutions and demonstrating keen intellect. She keeps me on my toes with insightful ideas and questions, which I deeply appreciate as she raises the caliber of class discussions. It is exceedingly rare to see a student of her quality and one with so much leadership ability and drive this early in her library career. I regard her as having excellent potential for leadership in the library profession, which she is already demonstrating. I fully expect that she will rise quickly to a library managerial position after graduation. So, you know, I'm looking into my crystal ball here in 2017, and what do I see today? Stacy Brody, named a Library Journal 2021 Librarian of the Year. She has been named Librarian of the Year by Library Journal for her work volunteering with the Librarian Reserve Corps, a World Health Organization global outbreak alert and response network partner. So according, you know, I'll just read this really quickly because according to Stacy, the LRC volunteers provide extra support to the WHO Global COVID-19 database in order to help users find and synthesize information related to the pandemic. She says her work ultimately impacts the public through decisions made based on the application of clinical guidelines and reviews. So that's my intro for Stacy. Great to see you back at Rutgers, Stacy.
Great, thank you so much. It is a pleasure to quote unquote be here. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay, great. Okay, so I'll go a little bit over the tales of the early career librarian, and thank you for the great introduction. The curiosity continues. It's always lots of questions, so hopefully we'll all be on our toes this evening to go through a really great panel discussion, which I'm really excited for. So thank you again for inviting me to speak. It's really an honor and a pleasure to talk to the current class of master's students at the Rutgers School of Communication and Information, and to engage in discussion with the researchers and librarians at Rutgers University. So as Dr. Radford mentioned, I've had a variety of experiences, and I'll talk a little bit about my experience leading up to my Master's of Information at Rutgers and then following graduation, first as a National Library of Medicine Associate Fellow, then briefly as a contract librarian at the USDA, followed by my current position as a reference and instruction librarian at Himmelfarb Health Sciences Library at George Washington University, and an accidental leader of an international network of librarian volunteers. So when I was in the Master of Information program, several times I had people tell me, this is a degree you get, so you can get a title and then you get a pay bump. And I don't think this is necessarily uncommon rhetoric. And I don't think it's necessarily wholly problematic. I think there's a lot you learn on the job in this field. Things change very quickly, whether it's the information landscape, the standards we're using, funder requirements, what's in our collections. It all changes fairly quickly, and there are practical skills or even tacit skills that you just can't cover in library school. But even as I knew I was going to learn on the job, I saw that everything built on something else. So Dr. Radford mentioned a little bit about my background leading into the Master of Information program. And kind of starting before that, I was a Bachelor's of Science student at School of Environmental and Biological Sciences. So just on the other side of town, if you're familiar with New Brunswick. And as a science student, I was learning a lot about how to conduct literature-based research. So not only was I working in the field and in the laboratory, but I was spending lots of time in the library trying to collect older references and synthesize that information. I was participating in scientific journal clubs to learn how to read the evidence, how to find the evidence, and then interpret and apply it. There's information everywhere, and we were always interacting with it. So that continued, and as Dr. Radford mentioned, I was working in the wine industry. So first managing a winery tasting room and then working in wine sales and figuring out how to use data for buying, selling, marketing. And this I continue to use when I'm looking at collection development or what time of day to plan a class or a workshop. It's something that I've continued to use for program promotion and evaluation. Continuing into the wine a little more, looking at call center support and sales interviews. So sometimes I think these skills get discounted or you're told to leave them off a resume or a CV, but I found them essential to inform how I've thought about practice in library and information science. So how can I talk to someone who maybe has an idea of what they need, but doesn't necessarily know which bottle of wine they want, or how to complete a purchase on the internet. And then finally, informal education and communication. So teaching wine classes and trying to translate fairly complex topics and not use jargon so I can communicate to a general audience. So I brought all of these varied experiences to the Master of Information program, as I'm sure many people in the audience also have a variety of different backgrounds. So I brought lessons from classes like human information, behavior, and cataloging. I brought these experiences to those classes and lessons from those classes to the positions following the MI program. And as I've gone along in my career and the more I continue to work as a professional librarian, the more I realize that even though I really love the sound of the degree Master of Information, and I think it's very cool, I am not a master of information. I don't think there are really masters of information, and that it's this constant process of mastering information. The information landscape is dynamic and much of it is uncharted. And this has become even more evident in the COVID-19 pandemic. So I look to experts in the field, longtime practitioners and researchers like we have here today for our panel in a bit, to learn more about what changes they've seen in their careers. I read the literature describing these changes, things like meta-research articles, describing the evolution of evidence. And sometimes I'm figuring out I need to write my own directions. But to do that, it's important to find these guides. So one of the things we're doing now with the Librarian Reserve Corps is writing a new set of directions or best practices for searching during public health emergencies. So I'm finding myself asking, who has these unique skills and experiences? Who are my guides in this? And how can we synthesize their knowledge and put that together as a set of guideposts for librarians navigating this landscape? We have some maps to study this information landscape. It might be dynamic, but some of it we have a little bit of knowledge about. But we also recognize that some of these maps are problematic or incomplete. I'm always a big picture person and I want to know why, so I take great pleasure in studying a lot of these maps and in challenging them. Sometimes this new perspective is welcome, especially if things have been done the same way for a while. Other times it tends to rock the boat, so finding that careful balance. And this question of why has come to the forefront recently, at least for me, as it pertains to the topic of naming and subject headings. So trying to reframe discussions in classes I teach, and recently submitting a response to requests for information on racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. Because the maps we use in this information landscape, these subject headings, in some cases, can reflect and perpetuate biases. And we'll dive more into this in the panel discussion later. But these maps, like I said, they've only gone so far, and some of this information landscape remains uncharted. So especially now, I'm asking and trying to chart where we share and find information in urgent and rapidly changing times, like the current emergency response. On what platforms do we find this information? Are they open to everyone, and should they be open to everyone? Another way in which we chart our course is to ask when we need to get somewhere. By when do I need to reach point X or past point Y? And these have been crucial project management skills that you might find your professors are modeling in scaffolded assignments. So planning out project timelines to meet deadlines and making sure the dependent task falls after the one on which it depends. So bringing those skills out from the MI program into the real world, into my professional life. and the ones you've learned from your guides, studied the map to its edges, and charted the course beyond, you need to tell others how to get there. So documentation, manuals, best practices, these can be fairly prescriptive or guideposts for another's journey. Then it's time to lead the way. So raise the big questions, bring along all your experience before and during the master's program, and forge a new path to maybe even change the map. So with that, we have some amazing guides, and I'm really excited that they agreed to be on the panel discussion here with us this evening. We're going to ask them about the map as it stands, where we need some of these new directions, and how we might make something new. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Connie, and we'll get started.
Well, thank you, Stacy. That was amazing. You've accomplished so much so fast. And it's been a delight. So thank you for sharing your journey already. So I'd like to invite Emily Dubinsky to go ahead and give us her opening comments. Emily, go ahead and take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Connie. And thanks, Stacy, for the invitation, and to everyone at Rutgers for having me tonight. It's really wonderful to see student names in the chat and in front of these black squares. So shouts out to Sarah and Christine and Joe and everybody. It's really nice to see you here. So when I think about the map and where it was when I started and where it's going, I think I'm in a particularly interesting spot right now. So my current job is to serve as interim chief librarian of the Graduate Center Library here in New York City during a pandemic job I took over as the 2 days after we closed the building due to a presumptive positive COVID test on March, 13th, 2020. So I feel, Stacy, like I've been sort of dropped into the middle of a lake, and I'm trying to paddle my way out. And so I'm looking forward to talking about what those directions look like. I found over the last year and change that I've been doing this, that I am somewhat of a library traditionalist. I think many of the places we've been are exactly the places we're going to be going. Selecting and acquiring resources, describing those resources so that they are retrievable by our patrons, circulating materials, something that became deadly during the pandemic, and where I spend all day, pretty much every day, trying to figure out how to do again safely and build the power necessary within my institution to make the changes that I want to see. I just really want at some point to get a print book into someone's hand again. Which is a much more challenging thing to do in New York City than it is most places, and at CUNY in particular. And then we preserve materials, and we teach people how to use them, and we connect them. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. I think everywhere we've been is all the places that we're going to be going. What's a CD-ROM tower or some other kind of technology. And so I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks, Emily. So next up is RU librarian Laura Palumbo. Laura, take it away.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's so good to see Stacy, who actually worked with me and other librarians when she was a student, and I see some of our current student workers in the audience. So happy that they're here. I am the chemistry and physics librarian and science data specialist for the Rutgers Libraries in New Brunswick. When we're on campus, I'm located in the Library of Science and Medicine, and I'm told we'll be back there in the fall, so fingers crossed. I've been in my position here since 2013, when I actually graduated from the library school program at Sky. In addition, I got my undergraduate degree at Rutgers. I was an engineer, and I worked for 10 years in engineering before taking a break and then going back to school. My research interests currently are about the evolving role of science librarians and how we can help support underrepresented populations in STEM fields. With regard to that changing role, I am I have an article coming out about that I've co-authored with some great people from other institutions. And I think it's kind of, it harkens back to, I remember when I applied to the program and what I wrote about for my application. And it was about the importance of human interactions and communication with our patrons. And the research that I've done now seems to indicate that perhaps we are getting away from subject-tied responsibilities to a degree. Perhaps we're taking on more subjects that may or may not be discipline related. But the thing that remains important, and I've researched this among science librarians as well as their administrators, the liaison relationship, the interpersonal communication that we have with our users is really super important. It's just key to keeping our role alive in academic institutions. So that's really what's interesting to me now. And it's funny that it was what actually was interesting to me too when I entered the program. Things have not changed all that much, to echo what Emily said.
Thanks, Laura. So our next panelist is Associate Professor in LIS, Gretchen Stallman. Gretchen, you have a presentation you wanted to share? Go ahead and share that.
Yeah, maybe I'm the only one that made a PowerPoint, but I will share it. Does everybody see that?
Do. You're having better luck than I did.
Yeah, it took me a while to figure this out. Okay, so let's see. I decided to make a little presentation about my career journey in library and information science. So the first step in this journey was academic librarianship. And I started actually working for the New Mexico Tech Joseph R. Skeen Library as a student employee in the late 90s when I was doing my undergraduate degree. And I didn't realize it at the time, but this was like actually a really interesting time of transition for libraries in terms of technology and online access to resources. So I was working there as a student employee, and then I became a permanent employee in 2001, and I continued there until 2007. The next stop, information professional. So I was frustrated by the lack of opportunities for career growth in the library. It was a small academic library. And I heard about a job across campus at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. And so I was hired there in 2007, and I completed my master's degree in library science online while I was working for the National Radio Astronomy Observatory as a technical writer and documentation specialist. And I was actually managing engineering documentation for a large telescope project called ALMA, or the Atacama Large Millimeter Submillimeter Array. And the telescope was being built in Chile, which led to an exciting opportunity to live and work in Chile between 2011 and 2012 or 2013. And I guess it's worth mentioning that I also worked in the wine industry in Chile. I worked for Wines of Chile writing content for their website. So maybe there's a connection between LIS and wine here. Okay, so then I still had in mind that I wanted to do a PhD and more fully explore dynamics associated with collaboration and large-scale technology, especially in terms of research data. So I returned to the US to study at the iSchool at the University of Arizona. And there I was very fortunate to get involved in some very interesting projects as a graduate assistant. So for example, I was a graduate assistant for the NSF-funded Institute for Empowering Long-Tail Research, which was a pilot project that collected scientists together to discuss models for data curation in natural sciences. I also worked as a fellow in the research development office for the university. So I assisted with communicating funding opportunities to the U of A research community and with proposal development. And I worked for the Astrolabe project, which was another NSF-funded project building cloud-based analysis tools for astronomers using a cyber infrastructure environment that was originally designed for life sciences. So then I came here, and I'm really happy to be here at Rutgers as a faculty member in the LIS department, which is a department that's absolutely full of lovely colleagues and students. My research interests are are long-term management of research data, and I'm particularly interested in smaller data sets, smaller heterogeneous data sets. And I'm also interested in scholarly communication paradigms and social, technical, and institutional infrastructures for data curation. So some of the things I'm working on right now, I'm still dealing with my dissertation data and projects related to that. So for my dissertation, I conducted a survey of authors of astronomy journal articles to learn about accessibility and characteristics of data behind papers. And I also looked at the way people identify and search for data through the literature. And overall, I'm interested in astronomy research practices, including things like institutional influences on research communities, distribution of research resources, and how individual people relate to experiences surrounding data life cycles. I'm also involved in the Network for Earth-Based Research, Education, and Innovation with Data, or NERIAD. And I am on the steering committee of the Unified Astronomy Thesaurus, and there are research projects associated with both of those organizations. And teaching in the MI program, I'm teaching, and I have been teaching human information behavior and organizing information. I think I went a little bit over my time, but if you have any thoughts or want to follow up with me, that's my email address, and feel free to get in touch.
Gretchen, thank you so very much for that. The amazing, the journeys that you all have taken to get to this very same point are just fascinating to me. So our next speaker is Ryan Womack. Ryan is also from RU Libraries. So Ryan, take it away. And by the way, we're still right on time, so you're good.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'm just going to, I guess, describe my own journey informally, and hearing Stacy's comments, a lot of the themes that she talked about resonated with me, so I'm going to maybe highlight a little bit of that. I started out, I currently define myself as a data librarian, and I started out back in the last century, I like to say that, as entering librarianship as more of a traditional subject specialist. So I started out as a business and economics librarian, and had a primarily subject liaison defined role. But in 2008, the opportunity came about to move into a data-focused role. And I think because of my interest in working with financial data, working with those types of things were always the most exciting part to me of the work that I did. So I got into data going back at that point. Now it seems like a long time ago. In 2008, data science was not yet a thing. There were not lots of data science graduates out there. And I have kind of ridden that wave of interest in the growing interest in all things data science for a decade or more. I started learning things like R and teaching R workshops. Kind of got bitten by that bug, and I think Stacy was talking about learning on the job, and I think that's actually a really important part of things, because I don't think I could have ever predicted the things I would be doing now were not things I would have predicted going back to the beginning of my career. And in any given year, 90% of what I'm doing is based on what I did last year, but over time, that entire knowledge base, I think, has been refreshed and changed in various ways. So, that's been a very interesting journey for me. And I think also among the things that Stacy said, I think that we've now reached this point. I think data librarianship is interesting because it's a place that interacts with other things that are not librarianship. So in other spheres, most of the people working with research data are not coming from a library background. But what the LIS training gives you, and the sort of whole mindset that it gives you, is, as Stacy was saying, this focus on helping people, communicating to others. And it's actually surprising when you realize that not everyone gets that, right? Other people who are working in the same area don't get that, and they don't have that focus, and that really enables you to do things that people will be very appreciative of. They'll be appreciative of the help that you can offer, of the things that you can build and design for them in ways that others just kind of don't go in that direction. And then I think the final thing that I would touch on would be the need to find your own community. Like if you find your community of interest, those are people who can inspire you in your own professional growth, who can help you along the way and sort of form that support system. For me, I found that in working with iAssist, which is an international data organization, and getting to learn what happens in other countries, again, where data archives exist that really don't have, they have an information science type of focus, but they don't have people who define themselves as librarians. And I think another great thing about this career is that along the way, you do have this ability to define yourself, move in directions of your own interest, and kind of, as long as you're learning and adapting, it's an exciting journey, right? It is a career that can evolve, and I feel like I've done that, and I think that it only remains a challenge. It's a challenge to kind of keep looking around and looking at what's relevant today, what you may need to move into next, which, as I think Marie said, keeps you on your toes.
Indeed. So with that, I think we're ready for our panel. Stacy, do you want to go ahead and kind of kick us off with our panel discussion?
Yeah, great. I'm going to echo the finding your people. This is a really exciting opportunity to just geek out for the next 30 minutes to however long people have Q&A for. So thank you again for being here. And it was nice to hear that, we have these traditional core themes, but maybe new applications, skills, and technologies. So we'll see how that comes out in some of the questions that I put together to get us started. So I'll get started. Whether it's data collection and our data labels or a catalog, one thing I didn't anticipate when I entered graduate school and now kind of working on the job is the great power librarians and information professionals have. Yes, we're dealing with information all the time and we need to be able to organize and find it. But I think something that struck me more is this power of labels and the power of naming. And this has arisen in various aspects of my work, from teaching medical students to designing and naming LibGuides and making sure people can find them on our library website. So I wanted to pose the question, how do we as librarians who are and information professionals who are interested in making things findable, how do we balance that findability with equity, and how do we hold kind of the standards making libraries and the organizations that are putting these standards together? How can we hold them accountable, or do we take the power at the local level and use that? So what is this balance in subject headings and naming for findability and computation versus equity and power?
Thanks for the softball question, Stacy. Wow, right? Like, I don't know. To me, this is one of the central paradoxes of library work, right? This is what we do for a living. We make information retrievable by using standardized languages and knowledge organization schemes that everybody sort of buys into and agrees that we're going to use so that we can make things discoverable across systems. So I don't know. I've done a lot of work on this. Kayla, I see your question in the chat. What about queer spaces and informational intake? And I got sort of interested in this question from my own personal experience trying to like find information about being a lesbian and having to take a bunch of different stairs to find the information because it was sort of split all over. Sometimes it's a science problem, sometimes it's a social problem, and the language that we use isn't sort of resonant. So it's definitely something that I think about a lot as a challenge. In my current work, I'm looking at how the United States has exported our knowledge organization systems to parts of the world that are not the US. So mostly interested in the sort of imperial holdings of the US. So how did Library of Congress classification come to take hold in the academic libraries of the Philippine archipelago? Like, why is information organized according to how we see the world here in the United States? And sort of that kind of question. And so when you're thinking about equity, what would be more equitable, right? And what's the solution to make it so that knowledge that is produced in the Philippines by Filipino writers can be the center of the collections rather than relegated to the sort of parts of the classification that LC makes it possible for Filipino materials to reside, right? And I think there's no solution, you know, and that is our job as library workers to understand the problem, to think about the scope of it, and to make sure everybody knows that the systems we use for organizing things are political and ideological. And, you know, I'm working on something else where a colleague and I are trying to record catalogers at work to sort of surface the process of decision making so that we can begin to see the labor involved in that and see how those decisions are made. So I don't have like a good answer. I'd be super interested in what Gretchen might have to say about that, because I think the problems of translating across time, which I think about as like sort of queer identity, is true when we're trying to communicate about science across time as well. And I don't know how to do it ethically, and I don't even know how to do it so that it helps us keep making meaning in the present. It's a good question.
And I don't think I have a good answer to that one. I didn't take any notes, but I mean, I do have lots of thoughts about the importance of collecting data over time for different areas of science, including social sciences. But as far as, you know, I know that this is a critical thing in our field, thinking about the great responsibility we have as information professionals in the way we organize information and set up standards. And I'm a bit relieved that I'm more involved with astronomy, and I'm involved with the Unified Astronomy Thesaurus, where we're talking about like adding new terms and deprecating old terms, but it doesn't really get into any of these like ethical issues or, you know, it's a lot more straightforward, which is sort of a relief to me, but I would just
really, add a little bit on that from the perspective of social science data, and just thinking about things like the race and ethnicity categories that have been used on the census over the years. And one of the things about that sort of historical data is you're always sort of stuck with how it was asked originally, you know, 200 years ago. It's important to remember and recognize that was how it was set up and all the limitations and problems with that. But it's possible to add multiple crosswalks. So I don't think there's just one way of looking at the data or the classification scheme, but you can have crosswalks or mapping of terms to many different schema, right? So and with the data question, it's sort of, I'm constantly asking people, well, what are you trying to explain? What are the categories that are meaningful to you? And then trying to find the closest match to that in maybe some historical surveys and statistics that have been done.
Yeah, and I'll pick up on making sure people know that these things are all political and ideological, and someone has to make the decision on those data labels. It's something that I've tried to bring into our instruction at at GW at the medical school when we're talking to students about like how was the data collected, because we often in health sciences use the same Office of Management and Budget prescribed categories, which don't really have a biological basis, but that's what someone decided to use at some point in time. So ensuring that, like, I don't have the answer, they don't have the answer, but if they can question it, they can be better practitioners and users of the data and the algorithms that have been created from the data. So you might not get answers tonight to our participants, but you'll get lots of questions for reflecting for the rest of your Tuesday evening. And speaking of that, we'll go to our next question. I guess kind of move tailing on from what I was discussing with health sciences and instruction. What can I, as a health sciences librarian, or I see there were a few health science, maybe future health sciences librarians in the chat, what can we learn about data management, sharing, and reuse from social sciences or from astronomy or from other areas? Is there something that we should be thinking of or that you think we might use?
I can talk about this from the astronomy perspective. So astronomy has a reputation for being like really open with data and publications and transparent with research practices. But even here, there are issues related to data sharing. So first, we should make the distinction between large scale and small scale data. So a lot of what we consider to be big data is well managed, but there are lots of individual researchers and small teams and smaller instruments that generate and work with data, but they lack resources to properly curate or share the data. So, and this includes social sciences as well as physical and natural sciences. So some of the findings of my research, I did this survey of authors of astronomy journal articles and found that a majority of the papers represented in my survey were produced using some data that's not currently accessible. And for newer papers, the reason for this might be that people are still working on their research, or they're under an embargo period, they're still publishing, or maybe the data belongs to a collaborator, so there's some ambiguity about responsibilities. But for older papers, this largely has to do with rapid changes in how data have been stored. So for later career researchers, especially, they might have data on obsolete media and no way to easily migrate or share the data in a form that someone else could understand or reuse it. So I think across the sciences, including in health sciences, we should be thinking about data life cycles also in terms of human life cycles. So in this example of later career researchers, there was this critical point. We are at a critical point in time right now where people who were active during time of great transition to digital media are getting ready to retire, or they've already retired. So I think something that we should think about as information professionals is how we can support researchers across disciplines and preserve potentially valuable knowledge. And then that begs the question of what we should be saving. And this is something I ask myself all the time too. Like, is the data in the dusty old cardboard box worth saving? And I would argue that, yes, first, because we don't always know what will be useful in the future, but we can also support discovery and these research over long time scales that I mentioned, where we need to create robust models of reality, such as climate change or some of the things that astronomers might study. And I also think we should ask the question of what health sciences can learn. Oh, in addition to the question of what health sciences can learn from astronomy, we should think about what astronomy can also learn from health sciences, because astronomy is a pretty small discipline in comparison. And I'm on the steering committee for the Unified Astronomy Thesaurus, as I mentioned, and several members came to the committee from health sciences and immediately saw the need for this controlled vocabulary because of the mesh vocabulary that's used in biomedical and health research. So there's lots of opportunities to transcend some of these boundaries as well in how we approach information science problems.
Great.
I'll maybe just follow up a tiny bit on that. One example of a project like that in the social sciences is IPUMS, which is if you're curious about it, you can just go to ipums.org, which is a project that focuses on what's called public use microdata, which is individual record level data of people as collected by the census, as collected by the American Community Survey, and also as collected in international censuses. And that organization, that research initiative is one that's taken all of these historical census-based material and tried to harmonize the categories, tried to align things so that they're comparable over time, so that they're and it's very tricky. Like when you actually look at the details of what's going on in each year, you realize that it's quite a lot of work. There's a lot going on behind the scenes, but those kind of organized projects to span large periods of history and standardize things can make an impact, can make the data more easy to use. So that's a social science example.
Great, thank you. I see a question in the chat that somewhat echoes one of the other questions that I wrote down. So I think we might have time for maybe one more and we might get cut off. But food for thought, what is the future of the traditional article if we move towards more of this data sharing? So someone put in the chat, how do we make sure if we keep the dusty box data that people have the proper context? And the context is kind of this article that describes how the data was collected and interpreted and how they maybe modified it or needed to adjust it or and analyze it. So if we don't, do we move away from a research article to make sure that data can be reused and synthesized in ways that are very rapid and we can respond quickly? Do we keep the article and then you have all these different types of data sets that are hard to compile? Has anyone been, maybe this is because I'm in like COVID land and I just see lots of case reports come out and I don't know how to tell people how to use them, but I'd be curious if anyone else is grappling with what's the future of the article, the research article.
Laura, do you have any comments on that? We haven't heard yet from you.
When I thought about the future of the traditional article, it reminded me that I had been talking to another librarian at a different institution just this week about the move to make data management plans machine readable. And I immediately thought, well, what does that mean for me? Because, naturally I thought of, what I do currently. And I wondered with that other librarian if that would mean that I would have fewer opportunities to interact with researchers about their data management plans, because I think that the new tools that are available for writing data management plans that are producing machine readable DMPs are a little more, interactive and hands-on. They let you select from available choices, so that if you're not fully aware of what is available with regard to data storage or sharing, you might find an answer in that tool. But in spite of that, I think we came to the conclusion that there's still a lot that researchers don't really know about data management, and that they don't have the time or desire to keep up with changes in data management policies and sharing, and that they do actually appreciate the efforts of librarians to assist with writing data management plans or keep them up to date with new policies and make recommendations for sharing or carefully controlling access to data. So I don't think it's ultimately a bad thing. And And I do think that the traditional article is always going to exist, whether or not it's associated with data, because there will always, as long as there are humans producing research, there will be a human readable format to the traditional article. And librarians will be involved in some way because they're still going to need help with curating, storing, and preserving whatever form research takes in the future.
Can I have a non-scientist take on that? I've been like thinking about, I just finished reading this book called The News at the Ends of the Earth, which is about polar print culture at the North and South Pole. So the kinds of writing people did on these ships as they were being sort of compressed in the ice and in some cases destroyed. What kind of newspapers did they put out? Because they put out all these newspapers. But the author writes about this idea of the polar public, right? Like who's the audience for that newspaper, right? Because it doesn't reach beyond the Arctic until it's like discovered by other people. But it had me thinking about audiences and the role of the journal in producing an audience. And I wonder if like I don't know, I published my first article in Library Quarterly because like the audience produced by Library Quarterly felt to me like the audience I wanted to be talking to. And I was really like connected to that. And it was like my dream. If I could be speaking to those people, I would be successful. But like, does that not even come into play anymore in the sciences? Like, it doesn't matter what journal it is. Like, what's like, even more than like, what's the future of the article? What's the future of the journal when everything is just like pieces and parts inside of a database? And then it's like, who's the public? It's like a totally fractured public. I don't know. That's my open question.
I think it's a good one. I haven't tackled it so much at the journal level because I think at least the medical students are like, oh, it's New England Journal of Medicine, or it's JAMA, or it's like they know the big enough names and they're not super specialized yet that in my kind of practice experience, it hasn't come into play. But the textbook issue comes into play because they go on their platforms and they search for a chapter on like a topic we give them. They pull a chapter on, I'm trying to think of a good example. They pull a chapter on some infectious disease and we told them the patient is a geriatric, so an older patient, but it's from like the Nelson's pediatric textbook, but it has the information they need. But if you were working and pulling a book off a shelf, you would never have pulled off Nelson's pediatrics. Like it just doesn't, context.
Like those cases where the container is actually meaningful and imparts meaning to the information inside is sort of missing.
Yeah. I'm wondering if anyone else has faced that kind of working with patrons who are trying to find information. Like, do they see the container? Does the container only matter if it's New England Journal of Medicine and otherwise whatever, it's an article I found in PubMed, so it was fine.
Yeah, I would say that there's a concentration of influence. Only the journals that have already established themselves at that sort of name recognition level kind of hang on to that. And I think those wide range of specialized journals are in fact being chopped up in that way that you described.
And I would add to that I think it depends on the level of the researcher. So I think, undergraduates don't really care about the journal, but graduate students and certainly faculty do care. They do have an awareness of, the prestige, so-called prestige of a journal, the journal impact factor, because they're publishing in these journals. So I think, that's a thing that perhaps needs to change if we're going to ever fully embrace open access, that these commercial publishers are, the accepted gold standard, but, they charge exorbitant amounts of money for subscriptions to these journals. So it's not sustainable. So we do have to pay attention to the journal and what that means. But I think you could spend a whole other evening on that topic.
I definitely feel like we could spend hours in this conversation. There's so much to cover. But I just wanted to also point out that this discussion reminded me of a paper called The Paper of the Future, where a group of experts got together and made some predictions for what the paper of the future will be like. So I'm going to put the link here. But the final thing that they did mention was to think about archival considerations and how this robust interlinked information can still somehow be preserved on paper, because that really is the, the method for long-term survival of papers.
All right, with that, I'm going to actually call the quote unquote formal part of our discussion or our panel to a close and invite Marie Radford back to say a few words. But the panel, again, this discussion is just starting to get going, as you all are noted it. And so the panelists have agreed to stay for 15 or 20 minutes after 8 o'clock for any of you who would like to stick around with that. So again, thank you very, very much. Stacy, you really got them going, and Stacy's going to continue to lead this this panel. But at this point in time, Marie, would you like to come back on and say a few words?
Sure. Thank you so much, Connie. I think my mic is on. Can you hear me?
Great.
Yeah. So this has just been such an amazing panel today. When we're in the midst of these, I'm always typing to Connie, let's just go to the last second. Like, I don't even want to say anything, just let the panelists talk. But we are going to continue the discussion. And so I'm not going to make a big interruption here. I just wanted to, again, thank everyone. And I always am particularly impressed by our increasing and growing relationship with the RU librarians, who have been just so generous this entire year with coming to the different events, giving of your time and your expertise. I have to say that Laura Palumbo was also one of my students. So I have to shout out to Laura. But it's just so wonderful to see this synergy and to have the questions from the students and so forth. It's such an interesting, I think, Connie, we might have another whole colloquium on the future of the journal article. I think that would be
what a great idea.
Yeah, I have a lot of ideas myself, but as long as universities are still basing tenure and promotion decisions on journal productivity and where they're placed, I think that there's still going to be a lot of traditional, you know how long it takes. I used to make a joke about academic libraries because there was a joke about getting rid of the reference desk. And I said, the reference desk is never going to go. You know how long it takes an academic library to get rid of a piece of furniture? So I feel that way a lot about this current discussion about journals. So let me just again thank everyone for coming. Thank everyone, all of the presenters, and you, Connie, as also Dr. Pascal, for your leadership here. And I'll stick around as well.
Wonderful. All right. So for people who are attending for MI Colloquium credit, you are officially have met that requirement, and you can go off and have your dinner or watch Netflix if that's what you're doing, or maybe study. It is towards the end of the semester, so get onto those papers. And we're going to go back to our discussion. So, Stacy, what you've heard a lot of things. A lot of people have been saying some really interesting things to you. What's your burning question now?
Oh gosh, I have to go back and look at my notes.
I know, putting you on the
Like,
spot here.
I know. I'm gonna like echo my sentiment from before that it's always just nice to be with your people. So like kind of like a side note, one of the things we've been doing with the Librarian Reserve Corps is leading database working group discussions. And we also now have a best practices working group, and just bringing people from different perspectives together, whether they're database creators or maintainers, or clinical health librarians, or PhD researchers in information and library science, just bring those perspectives together for an hour every quarter or every month to talk about what do retractions mean, how do we find retractions, how do we link retractions to journal art, like to get into these kind of geeky topics that maybe you don't always get the chance. Like I don't get to talk to medical students every day about retractions, even though I'd love to. Like having this space to talk about that has been really exciting. Let me look back at my notes. I will defer to see if there were any
Oh, Emily, you had a
Things in the
couple of
chat.
questions, or you had raised a couple of things in that you wanted to talk about more. Is there something that you'd like to jump in on? Do we still have Emily?
No, I'm here, but I don't have any questions.
Okay, well, I did have a couple things. So Kayla
I've
asked,
gotten all my answers.
Kayla had
Hey,
asked,
Connie, can I interrupt you for a second
sure.
before you get going? So I was just, I don't know if those of you remember, but and Stacy, I don't know if you were here when we had Ivan Oransky, who
Yeah.
did Retraction Watch. He is the guy. He is the guy who actually coordinates all of the retractions and keeps the site and documents all this stuff. He's amazing. We had him here for Colloquium. Connie, do you remember?
He was a Beta Phi Mu.
Was a Beta Phi Mu a couple years
back
ago.
in like
We should invite him back.
2015. It was actually in
invite
my
him back.
Colloquium, right? On him.
It was a real eye opener to see how much science is published, and then some retractions are done, but you never, the user doesn't see it. It's not marked as a retraction, so it gets really complicated when you have medical life and death.
Laura, you had some comments about Retraction Watch.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I like to talk about Retraction Watch with students when I'm doing information literacy about misinformation, and there's the case of the article that was retracted about the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine causing autism in children. The article was written in 1998 in the journal Lancet by Wakefield and others. And it was in circulation, it had been available for another 12 years before it was retracted. And the post was put up on that website, Retraction Watch. And this article is actually, I think, the source of the anti-vaxxing sentiment and movement. And it's based on false, information, bad data, because it took so long for other scientists to disprove the results. But, along the lines of open science and open data, the hope is that when things are made more freely available, they can be either validated or disproved more quickly. So this is just, in my day-to-day instruction for science-related classes, I sometimes bring up this website because it was something I was not aware of either before coming into library school or libraries. So, anytime if you're trying to convince some people that they need to get vaccinated, you might want to bring up that article from Retraction Watch.
That brings up something that for me that I was thinking about when I was approaching this, or like thinking about the panel and what we might discuss, is this idea of retractions and kind of the self-correcting or evolving nature of science. And one of the things that I've found interesting following the COVID information is that there's, I guess, an emerging topic. Maybe it was already there. I don't know. What they're calling it now is mid-information. So like, this is a brand new infectious disease. Like, we have no idea. It's not that it's wrong information. It's just we needed to get it out there. It's not really fully fleshed out, and it is evolving, and it's in the open, and so it can be vetted, but it can also be like spun out on Twitter or like taken by a press like journalists. And so like, how do we think about that? Is it open by default? I think that's something that I've been grappling with, because I love the idea of open, and then I watch it and I'm like, no, like it's again, no answers, lots of questions. Would love to hear other thoughts.
Yeah, I've been watching it happen, and I had cancer a few years ago, and one of the things that made me a great patient was that I never tried to figure out what was going on with me. I was just like, you have expertise, I do not, right? And I feel like in the case of health information, like how long it takes to synthesize new information, right? Like how much you have to know to make meaning out of new data and new information. It's so, and not just for like science, but for everything, right? Like I've been studying and thinking about and reading about classification work for 20 years. I just like can incorporate a new article in a different way than I could when I was first starting out. And so I think this sort of public open sharing of new information about the pandemic, I've been struck by how little people are talking about the background information you need to sort of integrate a new study or a new research result into your own personal data set. And, and when we're, I also, I'm an information literacy librarian by training and by practice and trade and whatever, and that's what I teach. And like the sort of push to help people like ferret out right information or the correct data about COVID-19, it's like for the lay public, it's like the best way to do it is to not try. That like people like, I want to do my own research. And then they end up taking mulberry juice. I was really struck when I was sick that like, I would Google, like I Googled like one time, like, should I do chemo? And like the third result was no, eat mulberries or something. And like how intensely rapidly run into just really dangerous misinformation that can't be resolved by me just like explaining what's true and what's not.
Yeah, so I don't think that nuance can survive Twitter or headlines. I think that's one of the things. And just a few weeks ago, there was that study about the COVID vaccines have been proven effective for 6 months, but that, everyone took away from that story that they only last for 6 months. It's like,
exactly, yeah.
We can't even prove, it hasn't been a year yet, so we can't prove that. You can't even get that level of information pushed through a headline or a tweet.
Because actually I think you need to know a lot before you can know what that means, and most of us are doing other things with our brains and trying to understand science.
So Christine just put in the chat that the messaging is key. So how do we get to that messaging and who's responsible for the messaging?
I've been thinking that the more you interact with something, good, bad, or otherwise, the more you promote it. So even if, you are trying to correct something that's false, you may actually be doing the opposite by promoting the misinformation. And this is something that I've actually been thinking a lot about recently, communication of science and, information literacy. Like there have been studies on, how do we effectively change somebody's mind when they believe disinformation, deliberate, attempts at swaying people to incorrect beliefs. And I think what I've read so far, and I've just started looking at this, is that you can't necessarily rely upon being reasonable and logical and presenting them with facts, that you have to appeal to somebody's emotions. You have to speak to something that matters to them and try to, introduce the possibility of how this opposing idea could affect them personally. And it seems like it's really hard to do, but I think it's really important that we all try, because there is just so much dangerous misinformation being shared, rapidly now because of social media, that, as librarians, I think this is kind of one of our key responsibilities, but I think I feel a little overwhelmed, honestly, about how to approach it. So I'd love to hear if anybody else has had successes in changing people's minds about fake news.
That's putting it well. I personally have not had any success with that, and I am constantly, my research interests are around cognitive authority and, how do we believe who do we believe? So the source of the source is where I'm interested in. Are you guys seeing any, effort or ability to, surface sources so that we can, how do I want to say it? Is there anything out there so that we can see where that information came from, and then where that information came from, the source of the source of the source? It's getting that deep now. That makes sense? No.
I
No, it does. I'm trying to unmute. Sorry. There's a great book that didn't get read enough by gosh, and now it just went out of my head. I'm gonna find it and look at it, put it in the chat. But it's a book about how like the social media amplifiers of bad information. They're like, that's part of the problem, but the bigger problem is that the right wing has more money and power to sort of push messages through that system. So I think like it's less about like what's true and more who has the power to like dominate the airwaves, right? Because like certainly the way I think about the world is not getting a whole lot of play in media, right? Like I you know, anyway, I'm gonna find it and put it in the chat.
One of the things that was coming up for me was the big, again, COVID land all the time. Some of the big retractions from like I think it was New England Journal of Medicine articles where they didn't really question where the data set came from. They were just like, oh, we get this really great data set of like clinical patient data. We should do some research on it. But it was a fabric, like there was no data set, like they just got it from somewhere. So questioning like when something like that falls into your lap, and even though it's published in this pretty prestigious journal and all the authors had really great affiliations, like thinking about where the source of the source is, and if that's a data set, how do you interrogate that too? So again, yeah, no answers, but it's a question that's come up, and I think that will continue to come up.
So we're all skeptics. I guess we just we approach the world with skepticism, but not cynicism. Is that how that works?
Within research communities, at least something that I found in my interviews with astronomers is that they know who to take a second look at. They know which researchers or which research groups might be more likely to produce bad research or not be able to back up their findings. So I think research communities are hugely important, not only in establishing trust within a community, but also conveying it outside of the community to other researchers and to the public.
Oh, Stacy, did you have you're muted yet? Oh, there you are.
Sorry, I had to make sure to add the book to the growing to read list before I forgot, or before the chat disappeared.
Got it.
Apologies.
Well, do we have any other questions? Anything? We did have a couple other questions that came out of the chat. Kayla asked really early on back when we were talking about categories and you know, the amazing power that we have to other people or other things by categorization. And she asked, do you think that this has to do with the concept of the victor writes the history? And is colonialism and imperialism, is that really at work here at the Library of Congress and all of those classifications, as Emily is pointing out?
Yeah, I mean, they don't just get to write the history, but they get to like make the present, which seems like the more sort of pertinent thing, right? Like the first academic librarians in the Philippines were trained at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, you know, just like shipped back to the US to learn how to be librarians in Wisconsin. It's like bizarre. And then, you know, I don't know. I could go on and on, but it's late, so I'll stop talking.
Okay. All right. Well, speaking of late, so we're at 8:16 right now. So if we don't have any other questions, I'm going to ask each one of the panelists and for Stacey to give a 10-15 second best advice for our current students around these topics of ethics and trends in LIS. How should they work with that? So I'm going to go start with Ryan. We'll go backwards. Ryan, what's your best advice or advice?
Well, I would say, yeah, stay open to new ideas. I think ethics is an interesting thing. We didn't, I think, delve into details, but one of the nice things about librarianship is that I think it is easy to be on the right side of things from an ethical point of view, and you know, just go with that. You know, stick with that, and that is our career can be a positive force for open information and open data.
Gretchen, how about you? What advice? We'll wrap up.
Advice, let's see. Maybe don't be afraid of what you don't know or what you don't expect. Take opportunities, be open to serendipity. That's what I want to say, because even in like all of this data practice stuff, serendipity is a really huge, important thing. Be
Yeah.
open to discovery and drink wine, because that apparently works for Stacy and me.
Drink wine and be curious. How about Laura?
I would just repeat some of the things that others have said, you know, about finding your people and saying yes whenever you can. I think that many people who become librarians identify as introverts. And I think I did as well when I was younger, but having gone through library school and being forced to speak publicly and, you know, interact at conferences, I'm kind of a reformed introvert. And I really enjoy meeting other people. And I've made great contacts and relationships with librarians from all over, mostly the US, because I think that's where, you know, unfortunately, international librarians don't often come to our conferences, nor do we go to theirs. But it was a matter of, you know, participating, get in there and participate, because the rewards are great, as Stacy is evidence of that.
Well said, Laura. Billy, your final thoughts for this evening, and we'll let you go.
My final thoughts. Okay. This thing called the library is totally bizarre and strange project that we're going to take everything, the whole sum of human knowledge, we're going to pull it all together, we're going to describe it, preserve it, and make it so you can find it. So my recommendation was to like keep that really flipping strange, because it is. And if you're alive to how odd it is and how much new stuff you can think in there, I feel like one of the luckiest people on the planet, because I work in one of the strangest, most unlikely of institutions in the United States today, which is an institution rooted in collectivizing and sharing material. That's really super cool. And absolutely find your people. And if you're in this Zoom, I'm one of them. Let's stay in touch. It's great. Looking forward to what we get to talk about together next. So I'll shoot you an email after this.
Thank you so very much. And last but certainly not least, our featured speaker and moderator for this evening, Stacy, what are your final thoughts?
Thank you so much. So I'm going to echo a few things that the others have said already. So definitely, like Laura was saying, maybe if you're an introvert, maybe a little reform. Don't be afraid to speak out or to write out as you see fit. If things don't feel right, if you have questions, stay curious and don't be afraid to ask. Find allies, accomplices, and your general people to geek out and make change. And I guess finally, don't question wine when it comes in cans. That's there was a thought about wine, and that's one of the things that has been on my mind recently. So with that, hope everyone has a lovely night.
Thank you all for making this a really interesting MI colloquium. Stacy, very best of luck. We'll be keeping an eye on you. Panelists, thank you again for taking the time out of your evening, and to all of our participants who stuck around. We really had a great time. So thanks again. There will be a video of this up. It will go on the MI playlist on the RUCOM YouTube channel, and of course will be posted into the Canvas site for my colloquium students. And with that, I will bid you adieu. Good night, all.
Thank Connie. Bye, everybody.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
It was great seeing you all.
Great discussion. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Gretchen.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Connie.
Bye.
Bye.
Good job, Stacy.
Thank you. I figured I'd hang on in case there was anything I needed.
There's always a few little people that are hanging on. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that looks like it. So you're good. So again, I'll as soon as the video is ready to go, I'll let you know where that is. And
Thank you.
I think did you have fun?
I had lots of fun. I was a little nervous, but then once the panel got going, and I'm like,
I
these
really
are
my
these are the people.
could not figure out why my PowerPoint wasn't working. I've got something going on with my screen shares. Anyway, it was really a pleasure to work with you. Stay in touch. I'm going to end the meeting for tonight. All right.
Okay, have a good night.
Bye-bye.